Late night creep show with another creepy ghost story. The taxi driver. Okay, so this story is gonna go. There's a businessman. He works in New York. His name is John, and he works in this. He's a big businessman. He wakes up one morning, he goes to work, and he's on lunch break. He's after lunch. He went to a restaurant. He ate. Now he's trying to get a taxi on his way back. And he gets specific taxis, but this time he's gonna get a normal call taxi off the side of the street because he's already late, so he's in such a hurry to get back. So he whistles for a taxi, and the taxi driver stops. The taxi driver is this rough-looking bum type hobo, but he's already in the taxi. He's too afraid to say anything or get out. So the taxi driver asks him where he needs to go. He tells him where he needs to go back to his job where he works. And he asks if he could, try to get there fast because he's already late for work. And he's going to get in trouble if he doesn't get back fast because he spent too long on his lunch break. So the taxi driver just looks at him and says, "You'll get there when I get you there." No words about it. And John just looks at him and doesn't say anything. So the taxi driver starts up the car and starts driving, and about 10 minutes into it, John's staring at the taxi driver, not paying attention to where the taxi driver is going or anything. He's just keeping an eye on the driver because he's a little bit freaked out because this guy's this big, scary-looking guy, and he's a little scared. He doesn't know what's going on or anything. So John's a little scared about everything. So John's not paying attention to where the guy's driving. Well, about 5 minutes later, John looks and realizes that he's driving out in the middle of nowhere. And John's like, "Sir, this isn't the way. Where are you going?" and stuff. And the driver just looks up in the mirror at him and smiles. And he's like, "Sir, could you please turn back around? This isn't the way to where I asked you to take me, and I don't know where you're going and everything, and I don't want to be here and stuff." And the taxi driver locks the doors and starts going really fast. And he's driving out on this old country road out in the middle of the woods on this old dirt road. And John's like, "Okay, I've had enough of this. Let me out, or I'm going to call the police." And John pulls out his cell phone. He starts dialing 911, but he can't get service because they're out in the woods. So he's like, "You let me out right now." And John reaches up and grabs the steering wheel, and then the hobo taxi driver, takes the back of his fist and just hits him in the face and knocks him out. And then John wakes up, and he's chained up in this cellar. He's like, his hands and stuff are chained up to these big rocks inside this old cellar. And then John sees the taxi driver sitting there laughing at him. And then the taxi driver gets up and walks out. And then John sees this big guy. This big guy walks down. He's got this shredded up robe on, and he's got a potato sack on his face, and he's got long, bloody, greasy hair coming out of the potato sack down at the bottom, dripping blood. And John, he's screaming like, "Let me out," and everything. And then the big killer grabs him and lifts him up and cuts the chains off. And then the killer takes him and puts him up against the wall and takes scissors and starts cutting into the skin on his arms and taking the skin off and eating his skin off of his arms. And then the killer holds his face up to the wall and starts cutting skin off of his back. And he takes the skin off of his back and starts feeding it to a dog. And he's got this big hunting type dog that he's feeding the skin to. And then upstairs, the taxi driver, he yells, "Get up here real quick, I need you." So the killer, he walks up there and he leaves the dog guarding John, and John's laying there bleeding out of his arms and his back. And, he's crying for help. And John looks over and he sees a rock about the size of a baseball. So when John realizes the killer's gone and the taxi driver are both upstairs checking something out, John reaches over to the rock, and as the dog reaches over to bite his arm, John grabs the rock and hits the dog on the side of the head. Well, as soon as he hits the dog whimpers. So immediately the killer and the taxi driver start running back down the stairs, and John runs and hides. And when John runs to hide, John is hiding like under this little table, and he's got the rock in his hand. He's ready to fight, and he sees the killer and the taxi driver walking around. Well, there's only one way out, and that's the stairs up. The way they came down is the only way out. So John knows that he's got to attack them and then get out of the stairs and find a way home. So John jumps out, from underneath the table and hits the taxi driver in the right side of the head, completely knocks him down where he thinks he's got him killed. And then he runs over to the killer and swings, and the killer grabs his arm, throws his arm down, grabs him by the neck, throws him over the table. John gets up and just runs as fast as he can for the stairs. He gets away, and the killer's so big he's slow at chasing him. So when John gets up the stairs, he looks outside and he sees the taxi. He goes up to the taxi and he's trying to hotwire the taxi so he can get going. And he's sitting there, he's hotwiring the taxi when he sees the killer running out to the car. So then he gets out of the taxi and he takes off running, and the killer's chasing him. But then the killer just stops. And the killer's staring at him, and he's still running. And then John kind of stops because he's wondering why the killer's not chasing him. And then the killer turns his back to John. And then John turns around, and there's the taxi driver on the other side. And John's sitting there saying that's impossible, because John's thinking, this is impossible because I just hit him upside the head with a rock. And John sees the taxi driver limping towards him, and then John sees the killer turns back around, and the killer's walking at him, and then John sees the dog's walking towards him from the other side, so he's got one way to run, and that's the left, because at the right he's got the dog that he killed coming at him, he's got the taxi driver that he pretty much killed coming at him, and he's got the killer, and he's wanting to know how. So he takes off running to the left, and as he's going down to the left, he sees the killer chases after him as fast as he can, and the killer tackles him and holds him down to the ground. And then as the killer lifts him up, John looks, and he doesn't see the taxi driver or the dog, and the killer takes John back to the basement, the cellar, and chains him back up, and he sees the taxi driver and the dog is dead. Apparently the killer and stuff, when they knocked him out, they doped him up with these pills where he would see stuff. So the whole time he thought he was seeing them, he actually wasn't. So that whole time he could have got away. But instead, since he was doped up on those pills, he saw those dead people. So the killer then, chains him up to the wall and walks up to him. And then when the guy reaches up to take off the killer's mask, and when he takes off the mask, he sees this face. It's got no face at all. It's just flat. You got eyes and everything, but it's all flat. So John screams, and then the killer takes this, screw and screws it into his neck, and John's bleeding from his neck. And then the killer takes John and just takes his head and just twists it around, snaps his neck. And then you see the taxi driver gets up. He's hurt. He's not dead, but he's hurt. And he goes back to his taxi, and he drives out into the city of New York where he works, and he picks up a girl. And if you like that, the story is to be continued.